Hello there. Welcome back to Zero Production Value Movie Reviews. I'm Hoernke. Today I'm going to be discussing the 2010 HBO miniseries, The Pacific. This was a 10-part miniseries back from 2010. Obviously, this is very much a companion piece to Band of Brothers from 2001. I was actually kind of shocked when I finally got around to looking this up, and it was produced 9 years after Band of Brothers. I thought it was a much closer production to the same time they did Band of Brothers, but it took 9 years to get this one off the ground. And maybe even more shocking is it took me 20 years after that to finally sit down and watch the thing. And it'd been on my list of stuff to watch forever, and I finally got around to sitting down and watching it. This is adapted from essentially two basic novels. One is called With the Old Breed by Eugene Sledge, and the other is My Helmet for a Pillow by Robert Leckie. This is a bit more of a problematic story to tell when compared to Band of Brothers. Band of Brothers had the perfect thing to focus on in Easy Company, as they seemed to get this one singular company that had a good cast of characters, and from D-Day on they saw just about every major battle and event sort of in Europe. They got to go from their training to D-Day to up into Germany and the concentration and the liberation of the concentration camps, and all the way to the eagle's nest of Hitler himself. And while they lost men along the way, you really got to know all these guys, and those losses became meaningful, and there were definitely a decent amount of those guys who survived, and you were able to ride this entire story out with them. So that being said, The Pacific has a very eclectic cast. For the most part, especially in 2010, a cast of not really any famous people at all. William Sadler shows up in a role, a smaller role, but he's about the most famous person. James Badge Dale is the one who plays Robert Leckie. He's kind of one of those guys you see and you're like, I know you from something, but you can never really get your mind through to what it is or where you know him from. And probably the most famous people that show up are Rami Malek and John Bernthal. Rami Malek, just a recent Oscar winner, and Bernthal, who'd been in The Walking Dead and recently Netflix's The Punisher. But at the time that this debuted back in 2010, they were basically nobodies. Rami Malek's character, in fact, in this is a very good character. He kind of plays one of those sort of mean military members that really gives the guys a hard time until they've done their time. And trust me, I've seen the type. So that being said, this is a very good production. The war scenes are amazing, and it's hard to watch them, and we're so used to amazing war sequences now that you watch them and you almost forget how good they actually are. These are very tense, very visceral. They show how difficult the ground fighting was on these small Pacific islands, and it was extremely brutal. I'm surprised. You watch it and you're shocked that anybody even survived, much less had any clue what was going on. And the fighting was extremely brutal, and that didn't always necessarily stop with the fighting. The aftermath, they show brutality there as well. Things that, could later be probably classified as atrocities, but, what was happening to these men as they're fighting these Japanese people I'm sure there's plenty of documentation on it, but, essentially they get to the point where they have to dehumanize them, and they do that in a pretty extreme fashion. Almost a whole episode, or a lot of time, is devoted to the John Basilone, who's I struggle to refer to these people as characters because everybody who shows up here is pretty much a real person. So it's a bit of a challenge. But in any case, John Basilone, who is a hero of Guadalcanal, we spent a lot of time with him. He gets actually an entire episode devoted to him at one point as he's at Guadalcanal, he saves a bunch of people, becomes a hero, gets the Medal of Honor, and then due to this and his notoriety, they end up sending him back home to hawk war bonds. And we've seen this in narratives before, where they take heroes and they put them back to the States to basically, get the home front on board and selling and buying war bonds to help the war effort. And it's a good and vital concept, but these men who are trained to fight have really struggled with the idea that they're back home for seemingly no good reason that to their mind, but they're doing an actual vital service. So in any case, Basilone becomes disillusioned by this whole process, obviously, and he takes another command to go train new guys. And eventually there he meets another military member who he woos and ends up marrying, and then actually ships back out to Iwo Jima with his men. So, but beyond that, but that illustrates kind of what the challenge of this production is, where we can't concentrate on one group or set of guys because people are constantly being either killed or wounded and sent home, and there doesn't seem to be that cohesive string of somebody or a group of people who just can maintain throughout the entire narrative. So as a result, outside of the Basilone character, we pretty much concentrate on the two characters, the guys who wrote these books. So it's their memoirs these things are based on. So it makes sense that we're focusing on them as main characters. To start off with, it's Robert Leckie, and then followed about halfway or so by this guy Eugene Sledge. Both are actually somewhat mild-mannered and not men you would initially think inclined to war. In fact, Leckie is a journalist by nature, and I forget what Sledge. I don't know if he's just out of school, but he doesn't really strike you as the, gung-ho type. However, their experiences on these Pacific islands and fighting very quickly changed that mentality, because you really realize that you have to grasp this combat and you have to get it right, or you're going to get yourself and a lot of other people killed. And also, the Pacific theater provides the Allies with a challenge like they've never seen anywhere else in the Japanese soldier. I alluded it to a bit before, but unlike the other people we're fighting, unlike Hitler's, Germans and the Italians, they just have a specific mentality that is not the way we think about things. And I'm not saying that to, dehumanize them. In fact, they just have a different mental model of what this was about and how they were going about it. They were fervent, they were numerous, and they had this almost maniacal devotion to country and emperor, and they were going to win or die trying, and that was just where it was. And to our way of thinking, they didn't understand retreat, they didn't understand surrender, and this is where kamikaze entered the American lexicon as they would go on suicide missions to destroy the enemy. And I always decry America's use of nuclear weapons. For all our talk of the evils of other countries, and rightfully so in some instances, we still are the only nation ever in the history of mankind to use nuclear weapons on people. And that's something that you really gotta kind of wrestle with a moral question. But it's interesting when you watch something like this and you see how the Japanese were focused, that it was going to take something extreme in order to get them to understand that they needed to surrender or face annihilation. And it's just, I could never be the one in that situation to make those decisions. It's just a very interesting conversation to be had. and something interesting to keep in mind when watching this. Overall, this is a very well executed miniseries. It checks all the boxes. It was well written, well acted, well produced. I mean, it looked great. There's issues with cohesion and focus, like I said, mainly due to the fact that you couldn't stick with a lot of characters, and therefore there were only a few characters as you're going along where you're like, okay, I got that guy, okay, I got that guy, and then there were a bunch where you're like, who are you again, who are you again, who are you again, that you just didn't recognize, and then they showed up and then were gone, and you really didn't know if they got killed or what was going on. So it was very disjointed in that way. They took to me, a little bit too much time with episodes and sequences away from the action in the Pacific and the fighting. I think they did this to give us a break as viewers, to not just inundate us with a 10-episode battle sequence, and also to show that these soldiers did get a little bit more here and there than just the constant fighting and everything that entailed. But I just thought it took a little bit away from the impact of the fighting, and I would have rather stayed there. But it's a minor criticism. Another thing that they lacked here, that Band of Brothers really capitalized on with the timeliness of their production, was the testimonials from the actual men who were there, who they usually introduced episodes, and sometimes we saw them at the end of episodes, and at the end of the series they finally revealed who each of them were. And because you were connected to these characters, you finally connected it to a real life guy sitting there telling you, and it was profoundly emotional and deep, and this just sort of lacked that. Now they did go through a bunch of what happened to these people, the ones who survived or even the ones who died of but it didn't have the same oomph kind of thing to it. And also, that being said, some of those people that they stepped through, and they're like, oh, this person went on to, I don't know, fish in Kansas or whatever, and I was like, I don't even know who that person is. And that spoke to how you weren't able to really attach to very many of the characters in this story. So this is not going to be as good as Band of Brothers. However, that cannot really be taken as a criticism, because for my money, Band of Brothers is about the best thing I've ever seen. If I lump movies and television together, because it exists in some weird gray area, as it's not really, it is a television show as in a miniseries, but it's not like seasons of television. So I just lump it all together. It's like basically some of the best filmed entertainment I've ever seen, period. And so to say you're not as good as that is not really that much of a downgrade in my estimation. So the Pacific really carves out its own niche in telling the story as best it can of these fighting men in the Pacific, the ones who fought on the ground on these little mudball islands that nobody knows the names of to this day. And even in telling Pacific theater war stories, that's a story that we don't see told very much at all. So for all that, I'm going to give the Pacific, the 2010 HBO miniseries, an A-. I love you. I appreciate you. Thanks for watching my movie review. I really enjoyed making it. Like, subscribe, ring the bell. As always, I'm Eric Hoernke. That rhymes with turnkey. And this has been a production of Zero Value. Thanks for watching.